For you who are new to BALLE, we are the fastest growing business alliance of values-aligned entrepreneurs, business networks, and local economy funders in North America. And BALLE really works to create real prosperity by connecting leaders, spreading solutions that work, and driving investments towards local economies. So to tell you a little bit about today's webinar, we are pleased to be joined by Angie Hawk-Maiden, who will be moderating this discussion, and Jessica Norwood and Sandy Wiggins, who will be sharing their stories about the work they're doing and cultural shifts that is emerging around community-centered financing. We will have 45 minutes of a moderated session and then open it up to questions from the audience. To ask a question, please click on the chat icon at the bottom right corner of your screen. It looks like a little message bubble. And then you can type your questions into the chat box anytime during the discussion. In the last 10 minutes, Angie will select questions from the chat that will be posed to our speakers. Unable to see the video of the speakers, please also click the icon that has a silhouette of people. The webinar will close at 1 p.m. Pacific time. BALLE champion members are invited to remain in the room for a 30-minute private Q&A with the speakers. So without further ado, I'd like to introduce our moderator, Angie Hawk-Maiden. Angie currently serves as the president and CEO of the Appalachian Center for Economic Networks, also known as ACENET. It's a nationally recognized leader in regional business development. She made her mark as a take-charge leader who quickly mobilizes assets, resources, networks, and entrepreneurial drive to develop a dynamic team and innovative partnerships that positively impact organizations' financial, operational, and service objectives. And decade-long tenure at ACENET has focused on fundraising, organizational and program development, and outreach. As a seasoned fundraiser, Angie secured the largest individual donation in ACENET's history, as well as new corporate and foundation relationships resulting in multiple donations. Thank you very much, and please welcome Angie.
Great. Thank you so much for having me. I'm really excited about this particular topic. It's a big issue for us, I know, in our part of Appalachian, Ohio, and it's an issue across the nation. So today's topic, we're specifically looking at this issue of to capital and how we're going about addressing some of these concerns throughout different regions, different parts, whether it's urban or rural. And so I'm really excited to be joined by Jessica and Sandy, and in our previous conversations, it's been very educational for me, and I'm sure it will be for all of you as well. Looking at our current financial system from our perspective here at ACENET, where we're based, we see an enormous disparity in those folks who are able to access capital and those folks who are not. And, a lot of you will have similar stories, I'm sure, to tell in your part of the nation. But what we see is that, particularly in central Appalachia, so if you think about Appalachia stretching from New York State all the way down into South Carolina, when you look at that span, central Appalachia is West Virginia, southeastern Ohio, Kentucky, and Tennessee, and part of Virginia. We see actually more chronic poverty. We also see a lot fewer options for community capital, and those folks who are looking to attain capital, literally only about a third are successful. Also, the opportunities. We see about 43% reduction as opposed to the nation, and how many of our folks have been able to secure capital over the course of the last 5 to 10 years, and it's only getting worse. So, and particularly in our low to moderate income communities, which we have been to quite a few of those in our particular footprint. So as we're going into this conversation, I'm, as I mentioned, excited to be joined by Jessica and Sandy. Jessica is a 2014 BALLE Fellow for local economies, which I'm excited about. And I just finished mine, and I'm sure Jessica's experience will be as good or even better than mine was. She advises on issues of emerging leadership, voting rights, community investing, and rural wealth creation. She's a lifelong fellow of Stanford School of Public Policy at Duke University, and Southern University College of Business, as well as the Political Power Fellow of the Hip Hop Archive at Du Bois Institute of Harvard University. So we are very excited to have Jessica with us. And if I mispronounced any of those words in that introduction, I apologize. Sandy Wiggins is a Senior Advisor and Director of the Social Innovation Fund for RSF Social Finance, whose purpose is to transform the way the world works with money. In this capacity, he has spearheaded RSF field building activity around community capital systems and their initiatives to support community foundations. As community foundations make the transition to place-based, mission-aligned investing. And as an aside, we just had a meeting about this with the Appalachian Regional Funders, and we're having another meeting about it next week. So this is a very hot topic right now. He is also principal of Sandy, can you help me on that one?
Consent.
LLC, a national consultancy with a mission to foster environmentally, socially, and economically sustainable communities. Sandy currently serves as chair of BALLE and was a founding chair of the Green Building Certification Institute. And I know that his fingers are in Ohio as well, so we're excited to see him doing his work here. So welcome, Jessica and Sandy.
Thank you.
Angie. Thank you.
So let me start off with Jessica. Jessica, would you mind sharing a little bit about where you're working and how that relates to this issue of capital access?
So we are based in Alabama, and we addresses issues of economic inequality in Alabama, and specifically we're talking a lot about interventions around African American communities, those communities that have been historically marginalized in Alabama and around the South. Just a quick sort of snapshot of what that looks like in Alabama. Income level, according to census, it's 50% lower than for blacks than it is for whites, and there's this huge asset gap. And so we talk about assets being, having savings and equity and things like that. Huge gap that happens all around the country, and certainly exacerbated because when you look at the number around income. And then we talk about what's possible around who's solving some of those things, who's helping to sort of bridge that gap, and what the space looks like around community lending. And I put up a couple of stats for you to know about what the CDFI landscape looks like, whose mission is to really work in those vulnerable populations, is like in Alabama in comparison to our neighbor in Mississippi, and then what that looks like around the country, and so forth around in Massachusetts as well, and what the disparity is around access to these kinds of community sort of funds, or funds that would target these vulnerable populations that we're talking about. And I think one of the big things that we talk about in Alabama specifically as it relates to asset places, how do you get something that's so wide as 141,000 to 11,000? And that's going to be things like land being taken through partition sales and sales tax, lack of access to legal counsel, institutions like the USDA failing to help folks actually get access to the kinds of funds at the federal level, and then down at the county level, the funds that they were due. These are going to be things like GI bills and a whole sort of other kind of policies that go in place that ends up widening that gap around access to resources and what it means to have these types of assets available to you. So community investing and community source capital becomes a really important part around what it means to fill that gap up and to give people a different advantage or help to sort of level in some way those equities.
Fantastic. Yeah, so And piggybacking on that, Sandy, tell us a little bit about where you're working and what your work is looking like.
Sure. So the focus of my work for the past few years really has been on fun ways to catalyze robust ecosystems of community capital. And most of my energy for the last year and a half, anyway, has gone into this idea of supporting community foundations. And this really came out of a long search, really began with the regulated banking industry for me, and realizing that was not a place that was going to provide the kind of stability that we needed to really build community capital systems, and started casting around for the other kinds of capital providers or institutions that were place-based that might really serve as nexuses for ecosystems of community capital, and community foundations came up a really interesting possibility. Not really knowing a whole lot about how community foundations went on a learning journey to understand, how they operated, and also see if there was emergent energy in the community foundation landscape around the idea of investment assets into alignment with their grant making in their place. And what's I think significant about this is that community foundations are not regulated institutions in the way that banks are, so they have much more flexibility potentially to do this. And during the course of this journey, I talked to over 100 community foundations around the country and discovered that indeed there was some very early emergent energy around this idea. So there's almost 800 community foundations in North America, collectively with assets that are approaching $500 billion. So we're talking about significant amounts of capital. Most of which, the 99% of which is invested in public equities in the bond market and, the traditional places that foundations put their money. But the idea was, what if we could support them in changing the way that they invest, shifting those assets into their communities? And so that's what I've been working on. And we've done a series of convenes around the country over the last couple of years, community foundations who have interest in this. And we're now, there's a joint project of BALLE and RSF where we are hosting a committee of practice of community foundation leaders who are interested in doing this work.
And it's interesting. I some time, so to speak, in a community foundation, and I think oftentimes, we get so siloed that we forget that the full array of assets that we have if they're leveraged together. I just heard a story the other day when I was with a group in Tennessee. We're specifically talking about philanthropy's role in this three-legged stool of private, public, and nonprofits working together. And the idea that they were trying to look at issues of alleviating poverty while their investments were heavily invested in payday lending groups. So it was they investing in the exact area that they didn't want to be supporting. And so the power of that is amazing. So thinking about community foundations, as you mentioned, they're geographically diverse and they're very place-based. And thinking of the people that you've been working with, Jessica, in your area, can you kind of describe what your work, who you really have been working with in your communities?
Should I go first, Sandy?
I think, yes.
Okay, sure. Good. So our folks, as I mentioned, there are a number of African American communities. We're really talking about addressing that gap there. And as this field around crowdfunding and all of these things start to pop up, this becomes a really sweet spot for us. Emerging change makers, I say emerging change makers is not just for people who are young in age but have emergent ideas, because I'm getting older and I have to change the definition there. But as we look at crowdfunding, we really do see that sweet spot is somewhere like around in your 30s, later, 35 and so forth. And so that's a lot of the membership that's a part of Emerging Change Makers Network. So there's a nice relationship between what's coming up around this new field of how we aggregate our capital together. But we work with a lot of farmers. I think a sweet picture there of our farmers doing business accelerator class, and a picture of some of our leadership that's gone and done some learning journeys with some EFIs to understand, what their role is and how we can partner with them more effectively. We've done some of our farmers have a little store there that we help get, and our leadership of our investment club. So we've got a really interesting mix of working with businesses. We work a lot with loan funds and other people who are trying to figure out how do we do our work a little bit differently and capture that group that you're always talking about. Work with policymakers. We've got Healthy Food Finance Bill that's moved through the Senate and is now going through the House, and we're doing planning sessions with them. So our network, our field of people that we work with around harnessing community investment ranges from that piece around the public and private and this nonprofit space around how we pull those dollars together and start working together to really deal with that big disparity that we talked about not too long ago that happens here in Alabama.
Okay, can you go ahead and kind of expound on the investment club that you mentioned?
Yeah, we've got one of the things that we looked at in this region was the idea of what it mean around expansively the word ownership, right? And so ownership in the sense of, I own this place, ownership of the idea of feeling more or being included in a process around economic development, ownership of to be in this work with everyone, so that it's not just something that happens as a one-off thing in some governmental agency somewhere, but we're talking about what it means to really anchor a local economy has to have more buy-in than just people who carry the job or title of economic developer, if you will. And so one way to really move ourselves into that space was to look at investment clubs, and we got the investment clubs a real roundabout, interesting way. We looked at and we studied CFIs. We took a learning journey there. We studied the Grameen Bank model. We studied we looked at in African American culture, our history around burial clubs and savings and loan clubs and things that were culturally very specific to how we aggregate dollars, how we solved problems, and what felt really right for us. And we settled on trying this out in an investment club strategy. And we've been able to garner a lot of interest to raise some funds. And the strategy is to maybe use that in as a gap financing tool with other financing institutions. We may make some direct loans out, but it's teaching us to start to think about what does it mean to not just be in the role of consumer, but what does it mean to actually get in and be a real partner in that value chain sort of system or whatever? What does that mean for all of us to hold the success and failures of the businesses around us, our community, our education system, all of those things, and entering into that discourse through the way that we move our money.
How are you measuring success in that model?
Right now we're looking at a couple of things. We're looking at money's deployed, obviously, like, how much money did we put out. We're looking at Did we create a job? Did we, or something like that, things like that. We're also looking at where our civic engagement is starting to shift. So there's a lot of thinking that goes into what's the style of trust and relationships among the membership of that actual investment club. So there's the things that happen outside of that, like what did we produce, livelihood sort of indicators, and there's a sort of social capital that's being developed, and how are we leveraging that? Where are we growing those kind of fields and those kind of areas as well?
And we're seeing the same type of thing here in Appalachian, Ohio. I mean, it's about relationships, because what people don't know can be a barrier for them to even ask the question. And you don't know what you don't know. So that's been a big issue. And that issue of developing communities and really having that trust and relationship, we have easily say 95% of all the entrepreneurs who come in our door are first generation. So they need to be connected, to folks who can help them through that very steep learning curve. So it really is about community. So Andy, looking at that issue, and I know we've had this discussion, looking at the types of capital, what works, what doesn't. Traditional lending hasn't always worked so hot. It hasn't worked in our area very well. Talk a little bit about your work and some of the models that you've engaged with.
Yep. Well, I think the foundation of the work that we're doing with community foundations, and what really is at the heart of the work that RSF is doing in across the country, is what we call integrated capital. And that's this idea that all of institutions or even an individual's financial assets can be aligned along a spectrum that's based on mission. So and integrated in a very deep and full way. And whether it's philanthropic giving or leading or direct investing or credit enhancements, providing guarantees, all those things are possibilities on this broad spectrum that we call integrated capital. And the huge power in that. And so of your impact in the world and your effectiveness as an organization. So the community foundation leaders that I'm working with, just back up a little bit. I mean, there are very clear common barriers that they all face. Culture is a big one. Because even among this smaller group of community foundations, and I would say right now, we've identified a few dozen of them who are anxious to pick the flag of place-based, mission-aligned investing. There's leadership there in those organizations, but there's also cultural resistance or inertia. Sometimes that's coming from their board or their investment committee, even from their staff. So culture, strategy, how do you develop a really strategy around place-based investing? And building capacity is another area, and then opportunity or deal flow, kind of the fourth common goal that they all face. But I'll just focus on the culture and strategy piece for a minute, because they're so important to this. The resistance that is universal, not just in community foundations, around this idea of place-based investment and direct investment really is a reaction to the what everybody's been taught, and even though everybody doesn't have a name for it, it's called modern portfolio theory. That is that you put your assets in public equities and bonds, and you diversify as much as possible. And it's very transactional. What we're really driving for, and this is really based on 30 years of experience by RSF, is moving from transactional financial transactions to a system that's based on relationships. And one of the big things that always comes up is the idea of risk. But it's very misunderstood in the way that modern portfolio theory deals with risks. It says, okay, you invest a bit in lots of different things across a broad spectrum, and that diversification protects you. But the reality is that when participants in a financial transaction are more visible to each other, when they understand each other's needs and intentions, when there's a personal connection, a relationship, risk actually decreases and fulfillment increases. And so that's a big part of the learning that we're engaged in. And with that, this idea of how do you develop a strategy around place-based investing, because it is very different. And you can't, there's this sort of tug and pull between strategy and opportunity flow. You can't, it's hard, it's learning, and the reality is you can't just take your assets and start investing them in your place without getting engaged at some level in local economic development. You need to be a participant in the system itself. You need to help build the pipeline of opportunities for your capital that will then accelerate, the growth of the living economy in your community. So,
and that's really interesting. I was at the International Economic Development Council Leadership Summit a few months ago and talking about localism, and they had sessions on income inequality. They had sessions on the food sector. They had they had conversations on localism. These were not typical session titles for traditional economic development. And so, but one of the things that I heard consistently from the economic development professionals was that I get it. I get we need different kinds of capital. I get that we need relationship-based. I get that it's not always about the 400 or 500 person factory, but I need help educating my elected officials. I need help overcoming some of those cultural barriers and some of just the knowledge and awareness that there's different ways to go about solving this problem of accessing capital as well as that relationship building. And we've run Sandy and I have had several conversations about this. We run a very small loan fund, and our best loans are those that we have deep-rooted relationships with those clients. They can come to us. They tell us before there's a problem, and it's a much more successful transaction than it is if we just were shooting out loans to people we never touched that weren't in our communities. It's just a different way of doing business, but we find that it reduces our risk.
Right, because there's a sense of connection both between the borrower and the lender, right? A sense of responsibility to each other that just can't have in an anonymous transaction. So, it's incredibly powerful. And so you, as a lender, I would assume when one of your borrowers begins to get in trouble, your inclination is to try to work through it with them rather than take the work out path of a traditional bank, which is all about getting rid of the bad loan rather than helping that entrepreneur or business work through its difficulties. Especially on side, because of the relationship that they're in with you, it's much easier for someone to throw in the towel and just say, I'm going to walk away from this when there's an anonymous transaction, rather than when you're in relationship with the people that are lending you the money.
Yeah, and what we also see, and Jessica mentioned it, it's the awareness of place, it's the awareness of the culture and the history. We had a loan that we had taken to a bank that the decision was made far away, and they didn't get it. And they didn't understand the value that was going to add to the community. Working with a lender who was closer, who was making decisions, they said, why wouldn't we? we understand the value of this transaction, and we understand that it can work. But it's just that knowledge of place, that knowledge of people, and that connectivity. And you know, when you have local champions, it helps with deal flow tremendously if you're thinking about developing a loan fund. Well, one of the things that, and Sandy had mentioned it a few times as well as Jessica, is that issue of the cultural shift that you see occurring. And Jessica specifically mentioned it's multi-generational. Don't just assume that it's going to be young. Don't just assume you know, who's going to be really bringing the value to the table. Can you tell me how you see the whole capital piece transitioning in new ways?
You know, when I think of, I'll kick it off a little, Sandy.
There you go.
That one. You know, when I think about this cultural piece, how huge that is, and how when we're talking about relationships, we're talking about place, I think there's a way where there's a disconnect around money and money as energy, and how expressive that money needs to be to our, or it should be a manifestation of what our intentions and energy really is, and how we can get out of alignment around that. And what I mean by that is one of the messages that start really resonate in my community is the importance around build really solid legacy. I have a lot of folks who are getting up every single day and they're going to work and working really hard, and the correlation between working really hard and actually having something for their family, actually seeing their community shifting, actually feeling safer, actually having resources to pull on to help with, you know, when your child's going away to school or whatever it is. There's a disconnect between those two things, and it's gotten to a place where all the way that we're dealing with money or talking about money in our community is very much about it becomes very secretive. It becomes cloaked in a lot of story and stuff and things that we've inherited and we've carried on. There's a lot of work around that we have to do around unraveling that so people can feel confident to come in and take the product, so they can feel confident in each other to say, hey, if we put in, this is what we know about each other, this is what we can expect, these are the processes and things like that. Shifting a culture really comes around unpacking all of that stuff. So knowing that money becomes the sort of the result, or with how you know you're doing a pretty good job at that part. But the real work for us is around unpacking the long and historic abuses around mistrust of institutions, around how we feel and what we believe we really deserve to have in the community. It becomes how we rewrite a story, who we bring along that process with us, and why we bring those people along, and if we trust those elected officials or whomever it might be to even go along in that process. There's a lot of work at every single level around shifting culture and getting it to honor what it is around legacy building that we say we want. And so that sort of new space around economic development and that whole ecosystem that goes around community capital and all of those things, at the core of it, it's around having these conversations about what we say really matters and how our money and our actions really are in alignment with that, and down long enough to do the work so that we can get the kind of equitable outcomes that we're looking for in our community. And often I don't see that we want to do that. We wear a lot of different hats a lot of times. We have a lot of goals that we want to meet, and it's easier sometimes to skip over that part, but I think it is the most incredible sort of meatier part of this work that ends up getting the kind of result that we're looking for when it comes to building these local economies. And Angie, that's what I think I hear when I talk to economic development professionals. This is that they're looking for who can help me with that part, because I don't know that part of this. And so that cultural shift that needs to happen, and integrating very intentionally that work, the way that Sandy is doing with community foundations, I think becomes really paramount to all of it.
And to piggyback on that, I mean, what we consistently see is that knowledge barrier, that gap in the folks that we work with, who typically are very small business owners, mostly sole proprietors. They're bringing their personal financial skills to their business, and it's not always the strongest. But the other thing that we see consistently is lack of capital related to being able to access that capital because they have collateral issues. Maybe they're tapped out by the time they come to us, so they're, the equity is gone. And so we've seen some interesting models where community foundations and other groups, private investors, are putting, for lack of a better word, and Sandy will be more familiar with this because I know RSF has been involved with some, a linked deposit, which can sit in a credit union or an entity and be able to provide that capital so that the entity can do that loan. And so, that's a deal. But even if you do, you have the collateral there and somebody says, I'll put it up, you really need to be able to manage that risk. And part of it's building the capacity of those entrepreneurs to be able to pay that loan back, so to be able to do it. And so, Sandy, can you talk a little bit about some of your work and being able to bridge some of that laxity to access capital?
Yeah, I certainly can. I wonder if it wouldn't be helpful, though, to give an example that works, and that might speak to your question, Angie, and the whole topic here. So and this is an example from RSF's community of borrowers. So there's a social enterprise in Philadelphia called Common Market, which is a local food hub, distributor of local sustainably grown food from hundreds of area farmers. And it really started in, I think it was 2008, when they launched with an idea of a couple that started the enterprise together. They moved into a part of West Philadelphia in the middle of a food desert and realized, they needed to try to do something about that. And just scratched their way along for a number of years, and got to the point where they were representing about 20 farms and just struggling, from hand to mouth to make the whole system work. And RSF, and were able to get a loan through our PRI fund. A loan and a program related investment from anybody that's not familiar with the term PRI, which is it's really like a recoverable grant from the perspective of the person that's doing the lending. So they took that, they were able to work with that to build the business. It started to grow quite rapidly. And this is a great example of integrated capital, and they got to a point where they needed even more money, and they wanted to buy a facility. And so what happened then was really quite beautiful, because one of RSF's donors and an investor in RSF's funds based in Philadelphia was brought together with the founders of Common Market. They began a relationship, and this donor decided on the basis of that relationship that she wanted to underwrite for them. So she provided a loan guarantee that enabled RSF to provide an even bigger, more risky loan to the folks. And now the enterprise is moving millions of dollars worth of food from hundreds of farms through Philadelphia economy, from small local farms to schools and universities and, the private, little small markets, and it's just a great example of integrated capital. Now, it took courage, in some respect, to start that whole virtuous cycle, but now that it's actually happened, other investors are kind of flocking in. So I think, getting exists in place, actually building things that work so that other people can kind of kick the tires is a great way to begin to break down the cultural barriers and the fear that people have about changing to this mode of investing.
And so kind of following up on that, I can't help but think because of common market expansion, there's been a lot of opportunities for other businesses to grow and thrive, new ones be created. So this idea of embracing non-traditional institutions who could be the potential lender, as well as mistrusting some of the existing institutions and some of the ways that they've worked in the past. Do you see this as being a catalyst? There are more opportunities because of that mistrust for folks to engage in these new ways of capitalizing businesses?
Right. Yeah.
Mm-hmm. And are you finding that as well, Jessica?
Something really incredible about seeing your friends, your neighbors, your old schoolmates, people who know the location, who have, in the South, and I imagine a lot of places, one of the first things we say is, well, who are your people? So when you can actually answer that and people know that you're there, you're going to stay, there's a level of investment that I have in my place to actually hear. So it does help get me in the door, but I have to stay and I have to do the work and I have to be responsive to what people are asking me for, even when they're not always 100% clear about what it is they're asking for. I have to keep turning it from the side of working with these new people who are coming in and taking on this role of lender or investor, because that's a new space and that's a lot of education around that, all the way to the side of where we're talking about the entrepreneur that's looking for a piece of capital and looking for some money, and they're worried about, or they've been shut out so many times that they're just like, I don't know where to begin. So there's a lot of work on both sides. But what we try to do is we try to bring in partners that also are in the community, that also have a level of credibility, and we talk about the place, we understand it. A good example, I was just at we've been doing a healthy food financing initiative in the state, and just got that particular bill passed through the Senate. And the folks who are doing all of the advocacy and lobbying work, I really kind of come in once it's time to implement those things. But what they said was, listen, we need to come and talk to these legislators. And I was like, well, okay. They said, because they know that it's somebody here who gets it. And I thought that maybe that, there have been times where I thought the outsider may have, made a better presentation. But really now for our lawmakers and for our folks who are working on healthy food and things like that, they really want to know that you get this. So you're not just talking about money and this and that, but you really understand what this place is like. You really understand what the unique needs are. You understand the entire food system from the grower all the way down to the retail side of this. You understand what capital interventions along the way really could look like and what they mean to us in this place. And because of that, they're willing to come back to the table in ways that they hadn't always done. And I see this as a great opportunity, but it takes work. It takes a lot of work.
And I would, and looking at that, I've been involved with non-traditional lending, non-traditional capital organizations that had good intentions, but a poor foundation was built, poor follow-through was implemented, and then you had a mess on your hands. And there was just as much mistrust of the non-traditional, place-based capital organization as there was for the larger one. So, so thinking about that, you know, and how we can really build this focus of place-based investing. And the question is to both of you again. What would you say are the cornerstones, those things that we really need? Who do we need at the table, and what do we need to build in that foundation to really not only at home, but make it work?
Question. So you kind of need everyone at the table. You know, you need the capital providers, and you know, I think you really need to develop an ecosystem of capital providers that can offer all different, you know, kinds of capital based on integrated capital spectrum. And you need the borrowers, you need the economic development folks there. And the big opportunity here is really to look at this. The reason that this will never be a place where the large, you know, anonymous financial institutions are going to play, because you can bring those folks together to really look at their community and decide together what's needed. So what's needed here for this community to really move towards a state of optimal vitality? And what kinds of businesses do we need to incubate in order to make that happen? You know, or what kind of systems do we need to put in place? And what kind of capital do we need to facilitate that? And work collectively to figure out how to make that happen. I mean, that's the big opportunity, right? Is to have a vision for where you want your place to go, you, the collective you know, the people that live there, and build the capital system that's going to support that, and the, you know, the business incubation, you know, entrepreneurial cycle that's going to make that happen.
And so one of the pieces, and I just saw a question come across the chat, and I know we've had this issue come up from time to time, that idea of inclusion. How do you really make sure that folks are at the table who need to be at the table, or as capital is deployed, it's not, it doesn't seem biased or seem like you're favoring one part of the community as opposed to another? How do you really make sure that there's inclusion not only on the input and how it's designed, but on the execution side as well?
You know, I think that it's a great question, and you know, I think that there's a sort of layer of this that I would just say is around taking the time to establish where your values are, and taking time to really build out and understand what that entire ecosystem is, from, you know, from the folks that are doing different multiple layers of finance or capital, to borrowers, to the community, getting those community groups involved. I think, and really doing the pieces around education for the communities to really lift up what are the projects and things that we want to see, to build those pipelines so that they're going in both directions. Constant information being fed in, and that you're putting out different, you know, you're putting out products and things that are responsive to that. Having multiple layers of stakeholders and multiple layers of relationships. We started our process built in sort of a value chain space, and so we took a particular sector and dove very deeply around that. You can do that the same with the piece of geography, but carrying that thinking and that lens around what it means that everybody, to have a value-based set of relationships help around that. And I think that the more that this becomes more second nature or becomes more part of what our new cultural identity becomes, then I think the civic engagement, the civic awareness, not just in the context of just voting, but now we have process in place where we actually know that when we're talking about what's going to happen in our community, that you don't have to wait for that to happen somewhere else. There are people who can be involved in that, whether it's from design charrettes and things like that, but actually bringing entrepreneurs in on that space. A lot of times we don't do that connection. We'll design a whole bunch of stuff, and then the entrepreneurs are over here and people who are financing over here, and being very intentional about holding that entire ecosystem together a little bit more thoughtfully than the way that we've done it, I think is how you can help mitigate some of that.
And I think that the point of being intentional is so important. Just taking time to make sure you're gathering data, that your board is looking at where are the monies dispersed, and you start to slice it. What does that look like from an age perspective? What does that look like from gender? What does that look like from race? What does it look like from geography? What does it, is there an unintentional even clustering of some of those? And that will happen because a lot of our folks who came to us for loans were people who were friends of the people who we had already given them to, and they were marketing our programs in their community. We're trying to cover 28 counties in Ohio, and so it was very, very difficult. But and that issue of process is so important. If you have consistent process, but the one thing that we didn't do, and the one thing that we are much more, we pose the question much more frequently now than ever before, is there, are there unintentional barriers that are keeping folks from applying? And is that, and so often there's an arrogance of, we're going to hold a session on lending, and we're going to hold it in this location, and if you're interested, come, but we're not really coming to you. And so, but we really have to change that mindset of where are the pockets, and it's going to be oftentimes very untraditional locations where we go, but that's where that's the place where there's a crossroads, and we can't always just assume that people will know, that people will talk, that people will trust enough to come. Oftentimes we have to make that effort of going further. So Cindy, as you're talking to community foundations about engaging in this space, a lot of them, I mean, this is messy work compared to what they're traditionally thinking about doing. That idea of building that, getting them in the door and then getting them to understand these issues of inclusion and importance, how are you helping them navigate the water?
They're helping themselves navigate the water as they engage. I'll give you just a quick example. So one of the community foundations that is in our community of practice is from South Central Wisconsin, Wisconsin Rapids, called the Encourage Foundation. They changed their name from Community Foundation of Southern Wisconsin to the Encourage Foundation, and it's just a great example of exactly what you were describing. So there was in deep economic distress. They realized that they needed to change their whole role in the community from just being sort of passive grant makers to really getting engaged in bringing the community together around a common vision, and started holding big public gatherings, messy, charrettes, you might call them, and were successful ultimately in getting hundreds of people from the community, entrepreneurs, as well as MPs and local government to come together once a month in these big meetings to craft a common vision about how they could rebuild their local economy. And it's an incredible example of the opportunity, and I mean, it really goes back to the question of, how do you prevent that sense of favoritism, or, and how do you prevent excluding people? A really hard thing, but you need to be inclusive and transparent and invite everybody in to participate. And you can build a common vision as a community around where you're trying to go and define the steps that need to be taken to get from where you are today to where you want to go, that everybody is able to, to see and to buy into. That's the way to do that. We need these kinds of businesses to make these steps. We need to, whatever it is, we need to invest in our local farmers. And, they're at the top of the priority chain for us, building the local food system, for example. Yep.
And Jessica, out of curiosity, I know millennials, the trends are changing so dramatically with how folks want to be involved in crowdfunding. There's all these platforms from Kiva and a whole host of things that are all coming together, and technology has just infused. There's just a surge of people who want to engage. How many people do you currently have in your investment club, and how are you, capitalizing on this, the culture of and interest in engagement on this front?
Well, let me take that question apart one way. And so I think the picture up a while ago of this entire food chain, and I want to explain it from that place so it make a little bit more sense. So along that entire system, it requires different types of money for different reasons and so forth. And we've done some forgivable loans out of a loan fund that we have, which is not the investment club. We've done a $50,000 grant for a farmers market in an area that was a food desert. We've done helped another loan fund with their underwriting criteria. In the healthy food finance legislation, which is a $5 million piece of legislation for retail outlets, and that will go for grocery stores, food carts, sort of corner store kind of rehabbing, if you will, add more fruits and vegetables. And then we have the investment club. And the investment club right now has 14 members and $68,000 in there. And the buy-in is $500 for that particular club. It's all African American, to support African American farmers in the rural areas so that they can get access to start capital sometimes, or they can get those kinds of smaller amounts of money that they wouldn't ordinarily be able to get access to, or they may have been throwing them their credit card or different things like that. I don't want them to be gouged in that way. So we've used this way. It's very small. We're looking at how we leverage that particular funds, and then we had to slow down the growth. We have a big demand for that investment club, but there is an incredible amount of learning that it takes for each person who is at that investment club to understand the depth of that sector, because they have to be able to make decisions. It's a democratic process. They have to make the decisions for that club. But the thing is, we carry so much, we carry so many other issues. So it's not just a farmer or whomever who may have a distrust of a system, but the people in the investment club have a distrust of a system. And we have to do a lot of work in both areas. And after we raised the initial piece, which was June of last year, so we're coming up on 1 year of that club, we intentionally started to slow down and do some deep dive around education to look at what are these current systems, what are our own values around this, what does it mean to be in some ways doing economic development, and how do we start to wear that hat in that place? How are we going to develop that pre-deal flow? So there's a range of different things that Emerging Change Makers does. I think I laid out a couple of different products, from a loan fund, helping other people with their loan fund stuff, policy pieces, investment clubs. And investment club is a portion of that, but we're looking at where access to capital, and particularly when people don't have collateral, when they have a mistrust of the system, where particular interventions along the way can get a larger share of revenue back into local economies that are actually producing and so forth, economies that normally would have been left out of that particular local economies that would have normally been left out. So we're talking about rural economies, or to some extent urban areas that have a need for what the rural area is doing, but we haven't linked them together because the system has not bridged those things. And so where can we put smart resources and bring our other partners along to help bridge those gaps, and then do a lot of education as to why that really matters for that area and that place.
Excellent. So, and I know we're going to go deeper here as we move through the next period. But what is your hope for the investment club? What is your aspiration for that? Where do you be?
Okay. Well, my big dream. What I really want is for a deep level of ownership of our community. I don't like the idea of abdicating that responsibility just to body somewhere. We don't even fully know what that is. And when we did a focus sort of group around what kind of products things we do with our investment club, and we talked about who's responsible for making the decisions for your community. A lot of folks even have an idea, and they're in the investment club and but they don't even have an idea as to who should be doing that work. So, I'm thinking about seeing that light bulb coming off, and that starting to shift. I'd like to see more of these kind of clubs popping up, particularly in distressed communities or that target distressed communities. I'd love to see more integration for us around online or technology pieces, because I think that's part of the question before, to be able to use these technology platforms. I mean, that's something that's really heavy in this group of folks. They're used to using smartphones and things like that. And I'd love to see people really get the idea around what it means around their own legacy. So my legacy isn't just me going to work every day, but it's also how I invest in my community and what it means to be a part of this kind of investment club, and how I align my values, my social capital, my money, my financial capital, and all these different things to create the kind of place and have some real awareness of that kind of relationship to their place. That would be like huge. It'd be like, it'd be big. It'd be big for us.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and there are so many examples out there, and I think of folks in particularly in the Asian community out in the Oakland area, and they've had these investment circles, and there's so many different things that are going on. It's so exciting right now in this space. But the challenge is truly, how do you bring it home? How do you communicate? How do you educate? And then how do you get people to take action? So I am being told by the powers from the chat room that this is the last wrap up. So we appreciate everyone being with us. We're going to be continuing for those folks who are members of BALLE, but for the general audience, we are going to be wrapping it up. So I have no idea how this transition occurs at this point in time, but I'm going to assume that the BALLE folks are going to chime in here and tell me.
Thanks, Angie. Wonderful. Thank you all for joining us today, all the speakers. We definitely appreciate the experience that you've had and what you have to share with us. We wanted to, before everyone drops off the line, let you know that we do have other resources if you want to go deeper into learning about community capital. We actually had a fantastic blog, a 3-part case study and story on Jessica Norwood, so you can read more about her story on our website. And then we also have a community capital toolkit, and you can see that on our website there at theolocalist.org. /community-capital-toolkit. And that's exciting because we have the Guide to Community Capital, additional webinar recordings, and access to the Community Capital Library. So at this point, we would like to thank everybody again for joining us and participating. And if you are a Champion member, please do stay on the line. We will continue on until 1:30 Pacific time with some more Q&A with these speakers. And we do also record the chat questions, so we know that there were a couple of questions that we did not get to, so we'll definitely see if we can get some of the respondents to send you their response to your questions. So